And when we look at learning outcome 2, here we are looking at primarily studying, we are looking at primarily studying the importance of human resource planning within the organization, how human resources are, planned in terms of if you are an HR manager. Give me 1 second. So here what we are looking at is primarily understanding the process of how planning is done in any other department. An example, very briefly, if we look at, say, for example, engineering as a department, what we do get to see is that if a new product is being created, the engineering department would put some sort of a planning thought process in place, at least, the product design, the product key features, some research, and, inputs from customers, and, competition is looked at. And once that document is ready, what they do is then create a prototype. As stage that prototype goes into, development in terms of creating, an actual product. And once the product is tested, it meets all the requirements. What you will see is that, at some stage, the engineering department will then seek an approval to put it into mass production. So similarly, in the case of human resources, when we look at human resources in general, you will see that there is a lot of planning which is required from an HR's perspective, and that planning primarily is required when they look at either recruitment, when they look at selection, when they look at appraisals, when they look at creating a new job vacancy or a role, and that is the whole process of planning that we will understand in the learning outcome 2. We will also understand regarding planning what are the key areas which HR looks at and how this management of planning can be associated with a model called soft and hard HRM. Now, this was an approach which was introduced a number of years back, and this approach is, applied by different organizations, in terms of managing, HR or resources within the organization. And this particular model, and when we look at the hard and soft approaches, was something which was created by, one of the authors, which did research in terms of, how these approaches can actually be, applied to manage resources within an organization. Now, Guest and Story were the ones which basically came up with this idea of soft and hard models of HRM. And in their view, obviously, there was a key distinction that we will also discuss, which is required to understand, the planning function, the planning function in terms of the soft approach and the hard approach. This also, before I get into actually, the discussion of the learning outcome, this is just more of a bit of a background that is required for us to understand that how, the concept of human resources planning has come into play. And there are lots of studies which have happened in the past few decades, which is specifically the theory X and Y, which concentrated on, studying the various approaches and views of how human nature and managerial control strategies actually work within the organization. So here, the idea when they came up with the Guest and Story were the two, scholars which did that study. And when they came up with this idea of, soft and hard approach of human resources management, they based their, findings on the on studies which were primarily done when they found that, a certain type of approach, a hard HRM approach, works in a particular situation, and a soft approach works in a different situation. And they then came across with certain key features and parameters which actually defined this particular approach in terms of, our understanding. So we will discuss about this in a bit more detail and understand both these approaches, which is primarily important and one of the key concepts, involved in when we look at human resources planning. Now, if I get into, individual, the tasks within this, what we want to be able to do is basically understand what are the key areas of HR from a point of view of organizational context. So as we discussed last time, there is, the human resources environment is affected by internal as well as external factors within the organization. So when we look at the internal factors could be from within the company or the organization, and these could essentially be other departments that are affecting the operational activity of HR. So it could be, say, the marketing department, the sales, the accounting and finance, administration departments. The external environment which affects, we discussed last time, was using a graphical picture. If you remember the pentagon kind of a shape, which basically meant the external would be legislation, government policy. It could be compliance, which the HR departments look at for, say, for example, employment-related laws, and dealing with the unions and stuff. Those would be the factors which affect the planning on the external side. Now, when we look at the context of HR, it is normally described into two distinct forms. One is that you will see some organizations take a very soft approach to managing employees, and some organizations, they take a hard task-oriented based or cost-oriented based approach for managing resources, and that approach will be called as hard approach. So one of the key things that we need to understand, if you see the slides which I'm going to put forward, are going to be to understand the ways in which human resources planning is actually seen within the organization. So these two approaches, they come into play, and this is where the research from Story and Wood, which is what they did in the early 1990s, came into play from a point of view of understanding why these approaches, and they came up with the idea of building these approaches because they felt that some organizations, because they're task oriented, or some organizations which are more oriented in terms of concerning humans or people as an important resource within the organization, they took the soft approach. So let's look at these two approaches and understand them in a bit more detail. Now, as we say the word hard, it basically means that the employees are treated as a resource, as any other resource within the organization. So sometimes you will see that when companies undertake projects, or when they work on a systematic project which is going to last as an activity for a few months or a few years to get the business into operation, or to set up a new operation in a country, or a new branch office, for example, you will see that that kind of an approach taken by the management seems to be a hard approach, because what they see is that, okay, we will require a project manager, a few other people to set up the operations in that country, and once it is set, that team will be disbanded or will be done away with. So here they treat, from a point of view of funding, from a point of view of costing, there is a clear link that you see, which is linking into the corporate strategy of the company, that we need to expand and open offices in 5 locations within this year. And for this, 5 teams will be created. Once the offices are opened or the branches are running, then obviously the teams working in that will be shuffled, or they will be re-looked at, either made redundant, deployed elsewhere, or in some cases disbanded. That means that with. The other thing that we look at in the hard approach is that the focus of the HR and the department is primarily on the basis of what is the business requirement. That means if the business needs 10 people to be making that project successful, they will look at 10. But if they see that after a point in time, once the operation is set into motion and the requirement is less, you will look at some employees being fired or made redundant. So here the approach primarily is looking at the concept of managing it from a point of view of a resource. Soft HRM, on the other hand, will treat employees as an important resource for the business. They see it as a long-term investment, and here they will treat them to be able to build staff strengths, skills, opportunities from a point of view of creating a competitive advantage. When I say competitive advantage, that would mean that they would see that, okay, if we hire somebody maybe to start that project, that same person could head that project maybe after the initial operations have started. So they look at not just the initial capability of having the employee working as a project manager to start the office or branch office in that location, but the person to be able to manage that in the future going forward once the offices are open. And here, because of this approach, you will see that the employees are treated with respect, and obviously the organization takes into account their requirements, needs, which are phased in terms of a plan that, okay, once this is done, this will be provided. Once this is achieved or completed, this will be provided. So there is a reward mechanism, in short, which is put in place, because if the work is done well and it is done quicker as against the timeline set, then in that case there are appropriate reward mechanisms which the soft approach puts in place. Now, having understood the approach, let's look at briefly understanding what are the key features you will see in both the approaches. So in the hard approach, it is normally, because I've given you an example of the approach tends to be short term. Once the job is done, the team might be disbanded. The projects, when they are done using the hard approach, typically have minimal communication on a top-to-down process. That means they will hire a person which knows exactly how the job needs to be done, what decisions have to be made, and once they're given that particular job, you will see that there is very minimal communication happening from management downwards, because here the cost of hiring resources is quite high, and what they will see is that these resources typically are they have a lot of experience to be able to deliver on those opportunities or on the project which they've been hired for. And then the other thing that you will see is that here the pay is there, or they are paid enough to recruit and also retain in some cases some staff wherein they feel that it is on a minimal wage basis. The other things that are important in this case is that you will see this kind of an approach which primarily tends to happen when organizations have what you call tall structures. That means there are lots of hierarchy within the structure, and that hierarchy within the structure allows these kind of project teams to be created. So their structure is more or less autocratic in terms of leadership style. You will see that the autocratic leadership style basically means that the person at the top makes the decision, and then that has to be followed through into the organization. And in of empowerment and delegation, because the person at the top has the authority to make the decisions, and those are then cascaded down, you will see that the hard approach typically tends to have this kind of leadership style built into the organization which is created. On the soft side, which is going to be more or less expected to be opposite. Here, workforce planning or hiring of staff are done from a long-term perspective or a strategic perspective. That means they will see this as an asset, and they will say, okay, in order to grow the business, we will need to have so many people within the organization to drive it further. There is a good communication as against minimal communication, stronger communication, because they want to be involved. The management is seen to be involved in the business, and you will see, in these kind of organizations, generally the organizational structure is flat, or democratic leader style is basically followed. That means the management at the top will be open to listening to suggestions and taking decisions in consensus in order to make the projects viable, or in that situation make it workable. So these key features which are attributed to the hard and soft approach of HRM, and this is one of the key models, key studies which we have to look at when we understand human resources planning. And sometimes we will see that organizations end up taking either of the approach, and in some cases, both the approaches from time to time. But it is normally dependent on the structure of the organization, how big the organization is, and in terms of what is the leadership style within the organization. Now, you might have a question: is which approach is best? Is the hard approach better or the soft approach better in terms of working, within the organization? Now, both sides, this particular, study which was done could not conclusively present that which approach is better, even though there was a lot of research done, a lot of studies done. But this led to a question wherein they then asked that which model is better or better suited with regards to the organization. Now, depending on the situation, sometimes you will see the hard model approach is better because it takes a more result oriented approach, and here the costs are also kept in mind because the hard approach marries the corporate strategy takes the corporate strategy into view when such approach is taken. On the other hand, because sometimes it does not pay attention to the needs and wants of the employee or the things required to make the business or get the business or make the activities happen, it tends to suffer from low morale, motivation, wherein you normally see that in this kind of an approach, because the employees are treated as another resource in the organization, you will see the employees end up leaving the organization because they feel that they are not cared for or they are not respected enough. Their needs and wants are not respected enough or cared for, and they end up leaving the organization. Now, in terms of soft approach, you will see that generally, the soft approach tends to work well with the organization, because most millennial organizations that we look at, organizations which are after the .com bubble. So you look at the likes of Facebook, Microsoft, Google, you look at Apple. Here, they have a soft approach towards the employees because they treat employees as a very important asset within the organization. They feel that without employees and without good people working in the organization will not be able to achieve its goal. And that is why it makes good business sense for them to, kind of recruit the best employees possible and reward the performance of the employees in order to keep them motivated and loyal towards the organization. Sometimes you will see the soft approach tends to slack, and then slacking, means that you will see sometimes the organization lays off a lot of employees, makes a lot of them redundant, because it becomes difficult for the organization over a period in time to sustain the benefits which are provided to the employees of the workforce, and that tends to put a lot of pressure on the profitability or the bottom line of the company. And that is where you will see the growing problem of companies in the UK or in the developed countries, wherein the pension pot in most large private public sector organizations are running in deficit, are running in loss. So most employers are expected to provide handsome pensions of 6 to 8%, in some cases even up to 12%, and these payments have not been kept up by organizations because of pressures of the employee workforce. So you look at organizations like Microsoft, Google, Apple, which has thousands of employees. But if the organization has a soft approach and does not keep up with the pensions, what you do get to see is that at some stage there are redundancies which tend to happen within the organization, and that then tends to kind of achieve the balance of the hard approach, wherein they are treated as resources, but they say, okay, we don't need that much staff, and they then have mass redundancies, and that is what we got to see in the last recession, the last financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So it is important to understand these approaches and how, as a HR manager, sometimes you will use these approach to make decisions and do planning of resources within the organization. And this gives you a perspective that to a certain extent, a perspective to understand that how planning needs to be done. Now let's look at some of the steps of planning. Briefly, let's understand how planning is done. Now we are using this word planning again and again, but what I want to do is understand how planning is done. Now, just to also reiterate, soft and hard approach of HRM, I'm going to send you a handout which you need to read, because this is one of the important concepts and you need to understand this in a bit more detail. So I'm going to send you a paper which is primarily a research paper, and that kind of summarizes this approach in about 2 or 3 pages for you to understand why this was done, why this study was done, and how this study over the years became one of the important models, when we study human resources plan. There have been lots of studies which have been built on, and further research has been done on the initial study done by Story and Guest. And then what we do get to see is that the soft model, which soft and the hard HRM model that we see, has been put to test within many organizations. And this approach is predominantly seen in the early 60s, 70s, industrialization, because it started to happen. You saw them mostly in the engineering production companies, but as the companies have evolved, the businesses have evolved, we've seen is that there is a conflict which has happened between the soft and hard models of HRM, and that is where no particular approach is single-handedly applicable within the organizations. So at some stage, HR management end up taking the hard approach, and at some stage, they end up taking the soft approach. And this has been proven by a number of studies which have happened after that in large companies like BT in the UK, Citibank in the US. We look at Glaxo, Hewlett-Packard, for example. We look at banking sector, Lloyd's Bank, and this is where they have said that there is no one particular approach which is conclusive to the fact that it is employed within the organization, but a combination of both, depending on the situation, is utilized by the management and the HR to kind of balance the objectives with the finances within the organization. Now, having understood this as a bit of a background, what we want to be able to do now is to understand what are the key stages involved in human resource planning. Now, a question to you: what do you think, if you put on the hat of an HR manager, what do you think are the key things that you will put into planning, or you would put or take into consideration for doing planning? Any thoughts, any ideas? Any ideas that you can put forward?
Like in what case, about what planning for the organization, or what?
In general, say for example, that's a good question again, but if I have to step back, why do you think we will need to do planning from a human resources perspective in the organization?
For company betterment and for it to grow.
That is correct. So one of the key things that you mentioned is that why do we plan in general is that when we are looking at growing, when we are looking at growth, expansion, we need to do some planning. And that could happen to look at what resources would be required, and those resources would be converted into costs, and costs will be converted into revenues. So planning in general is required to understand the process and where and how growth can be achieved. So that's a good point. And if you have to look at this generic thing from a point of view of planning for HR, what do you think that would be? Daniel? Any thoughts on this, Daniel?
Sorry?
Any thoughts on this?
Not well.
Okay, no problem. So if I just take this forward, what we do is when we look at human resources planning, that should actually be a link between human resource management and the overall strategic plan of the organization. So sometimes you will see that the companies make a strategic plan, and that could be a strategic plan that is put into place when they look at the new financial year. And when that planning is done, there is a plan which is also put in place for HR. Like the CEO might say, the board and the CEO might put a plan in place that we are going to look at growing the company revenues, by 150% in the next five years. So this is a statement which the board has put forward as a wish list, and they want to look at growing the company revenues by 150% in the 5 years. Now, at some stage, this strategic objective, which is put forward by the board, is broken down into individual objectives for different departments. So how will this 150% growth come about? That means maybe the production team, the engineering teams will look at what new products have to be worked on, what are the products in the pipeline which they are introducing, how they will look at going to the market. The marketing would marketing department will look at things in terms of how they can look at increased promotions, can they look at expansion into other countries or geographies or cities for getting customers. Finance side of things would look at things, what could be the financial requirements which will come in from an organizational perspective, and they will consider sending out a memo to different departments to say what could be the financial requirements in terms of budgeting for achieving this growth. So they might ask for a marketing plan, the budget. They might go to engineering and production and say, okay, how many resources do you need? You need to hire more engineers. What is the plan on that side? Marketing, sales, administration, other key departments will be asked about the costing and budgeting that they would need to increase operations and increase activity to achieve that growth. So similarly, HR at some stage will also be asked, and their overall plan will be dependent on the plan which comes in from other departments. So marketing would say, okay, in order to achieve that growth, we need to have this much promotions to be done. This is the budget that we require, and these are the number of people that we will require for us to hire. So we might need somebody else to do this, somebody else to do this. Engineering would say, okay, because we're introducing a new product and a new project is coming underway, we need 50 programmers or 50 people to work on this, and this is the overall cost required to hire those people, or the plan. So that plan, when it comes to HR, they will then look at developing a human resources plan for the next 5 years for the organization. And that would basically mean that, they would start a process of human resource planning, and that will ensure that requirements of human resource in an organization at different levels and different departments are identified, and appropriate plans are put in place to meet or satisfy those requirements. So if the engineering department says we'll hire 10 employees this year, 20 next year, 30 in year 3, and 50 by year 5, a total of 110 employees are being hired. So the HR has to put a plan in place to look at that many employees for recruitment and selection. And then they have to start that planning. So basically, if we look at understanding the process of human resource planning, one such things would be if a new strategic objective is put in place by the management, they would start looking at planning for human or people as a resource within the organization. If it is to look at training the existing workforce for them to acquire new skills, then the HR, with the use of appraisals which is done, identifies gap areas or areas in which the existing staff needs more training, and then they would put those training and development related expenses or budgeting in place. And that will be primarily reskilling the workforce for them to acquire new skills to meet the demands of the growth which the management is asked for. And the third would be that they will need to put some plans in place which will look at managing maybe the requirement of these additional resources in terms of more recruitment or in terms of more training and development. And then in order to effectively move the organization into that direction, they would need to put some sort of a change management also in place. That means at their end, when they do the planning, they have to look at phasing out this change across 5 years. That, okay, if the organization strength in terms of employees was 200 this year, next year it increases to 250. They also have their own planning to be able to, handle that workload of employees. So when we look at human resources planning, this is a 5 or a 6 stage process. The first stage looks at determination of organizational purposes and objectives, and these are then done at the top management level. So example which I put on the slide is if the organization is looking at increased turnover, then they also have to commensurate increase the number of employees who will help get that increased sales or turnover. So planning is marry the HR plan into the strategic organizational plan to achieve the objective. The second step would be to look at understanding, when I say environmental scanning, this would mean that they want to identify competition, they want to identify within the company, internal and external, the number of, say not the number, but the type of employees which have the skills to support growth or that strategic plan. So here they have to look at skills evaluation, they have to look at, gap analysis, or basically areas after doing the appraisals to see what areas the employees would need skills or training on and development on. And this is something which is called, environmental scanning. That means scanning the internal and external environment of the company to understand what skills or what areas which are gap areas will be required to, do training and development on. Now, the third step would be to understand, after this scanning has been done, to understand what is the gap. When I say gap, that means the shortage in terms of skills or the shortage in terms of manpower or resources required within each department to fulfill that growth objective. And that is called determining the gap. And that gap which they identify is then to be estimated in terms of some sort of budgeting to, kind of hire skilled employees who will be responsible for doing those jobs. And that then becomes the third step in terms of, identification of, gap, and then the determination of how much is the gap to then recruit that employees into the organization. The next step would be to look at finding the people which have the right skills and experience to work within these roles. And then once they do that, before they start looking at these people, they have to internally design the job description, the person specification, compensation and benefits. And that is environmental scanning also comes into place, because you cannot expect somebody to come in and work at a particular role at a lower salary than what the competition is paying. Or if your pay and benefits are lower than what the competition is paying, you might not be able to attract the best talent to come in and work. So the fourth stage focuses on primarily understanding and creating descriptions for which the people will be hired. So things like job description, roles and responsibilities, person specification, benefits, pay grade, structure in which the person will come in and work, and then compensation is decided. The next step, once you've decided this and you've got this in written, what they need to do is they need to execute the plan. That means you will see the HR department putting out a job advert, or will start to meet with agencies, look at internal, external methods of recruitment. Sometimes they place requirements for vacancies internally within the company. Employees can, apply from different department into a role that they do seem interested in, or they will hire recruitment agencies, put out an advert to hire these employees. The fifth step primarily means looking at starting to recruit. And the final step would be, once you've started and shortlisted a few people in terms of recruitment, you brought them in after selection in terms of interview and then stuff, you are then looking at putting them into place. They start working, and then at a certain point in time, you do evaluation or monitoring, which is nothing but appraisals to see if the new employees which have joined have started to perform against the job descriptions which have been set, and are they able to achieve the targets? Are they able to work towards the goals which have been set, and are they overall helping the organizational move towards that growth plan of 150% growth? So since when you look at planning seems to be a five-step process, and this five-step process starts off with aligning the HR planning with the corporate strategy, wherein it is broken down to understand this strategy then needs to look at resourcing, and resourcing then needs to identify the gap areas, the skills, and once it is identified, how they will hire the employees or the human resource through recruitment and selection process. And then completing the full circle will be to review the performance of the employees to see if they are able to perform as per the objectives which have been set. So if I have to summarize the points, First is, sometimes what happens is, I'll give you a tangent example. If I ask you to do your SWOT analysis, of yourself, you identify your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat. What do you think, and what do you think I'm asking you to do your SWOT analysis for? Why do you think we ask you to do your SWOT analysis?
So that we know about ourselves, like what are our weaknesses, and like we analyze it.
Absolutely. So Daniel, any thoughts from your end? Why do you do your SWOT analysis? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to assess yourself against maybe a colleague or a peer or a friend, and see what are your strengths and weaknesses against somebody else's strengths and weaknesses. So the aim of doing a SWOT is primarily at an individual level to understand and assess your own skills, correct?
Yes.
After you've done the assessment, what you do is you have to then put into something called, you will start a planning that, okay, I have, I say, once you identified, okay, these are my strengths. I'm very good at IT. I'm very good at this, but I am weak on some of these things. So for example, I'm not too good with maybe English. I'm not too good with, say, for example, public speaking. I'm just giving a general example. So here, what you then tend to do is you identify the areas which need improvement, correct? After your assessment, you identify the areas wherein you're very good in, you don't need any improvement, you need to continue, but the areas in which you need improvement after the assessment has been done, that is where you start to make the plan. So if I say I'm not good at public speaking, then in that case, what you will do is you'll put some steps in place so that it will help you improve your public speaking. So steps could be that I will probably join a class, maybe participate in some debates, look at, simple thing could be talk aloud by standing in front of the mirror. And those are things which you are putting in place because you understood the gaps. And in order to complete or cover those gaps, you are then identifying different techniques which will help cover those gaps. And those gaps, practices that you have to do to be able to speak correctly, or in front of public, maybe have participation in debates, and those things will essentially help you, develop your weaknesses into strength. And once you've done that, at some stage, what you do is you say that, okay, I'm ready. I've made improvements in my speaking. I can now participate in debates. I can, openly speak and, participate in a discussion, put my viewpoints forward. At some stage, what you do is you decide, okay, now that I think I have achieved this, I want to now look at, do a bit of doing an evaluation, checking that can I do this or not? So you maybe get into a competition, or at your school or your uni, you get into, a debate and you participate and you see if this actual change has happened or not. So even on a personal level, sometimes you will see that you go through this planning process, and this planning process is very similar, from what we've discussed for human resources planning, and it is a 5-6 step process which allows you to identify, then look at, forecasting, completing, executing, and then reviewing to see how you will make this successful. Now, going further, what we need to do is we need to understand two important processes within HR when we look at human resources planning. Now, one of the key functions, we looked at 5 or 6 key functions within HR yesterday. So it was staffing, it was reviews, it was looking at, recruitment, selection, perks and benefits. So when we look at these 5 main functions, training and development included, these were 5, we look at concentrating on learning outcome 2 on 2 functions in particular. And these 2 functions are recruitment and selection. Now, why is recruitment important, and how is, when you identify that you need to recruit resources, how do you look at doing the process of recruitment? And once you've recruited, how do you select and then bring those resources within the organization? So before we get into that, let's understand very briefly the definition of recruitment and definition of selection. Now, recruitment is defined as a process of searching a potential pool of candidates which have the knowledge, skills, and experience to work within the organization and basically fill vacancies which will allow organization to achieve objectives. So it's a very clear process and a very clear definition. You want to be able to identify and recruit the right person or the right talent into the organization, which has the skills, knowledge, and prior experience, and will help fill those vacancies and help achieve the organization of get to the goals or achieve the objectives. Now, selection as a process is defined as, once you've placed an advert, a job advert, you've got a number of responses, you receive those number of responses, what you need to be able to do is from that shortlist, select, the right candidates to be able to join the organization on that particular role. And that particular role would then be, filled by a person who is able to do value addition, contribute, and then take the organization forward. So the process of selection is strategically planned. It's a very clearly defined procedure or a process within the organization, which is depicted in the human resources, policies or handbook of an organization. And that is where, it is clearly documented that how will you hire an employee, how will you fire an employee to a certain extent, what are the key criteria which the new incumbent or employee will need to meet to be able to join the organization. So selection is a process of understanding that approach so that you are able to recruit. Once you place the recruitment, you're able to evaluate and then hire the right set of right employee or the right person for the right job, so that it can, when they are in that particular position, able to take that forward and help achieve the organizational objective. Now, in order to understand this process of recruitment and selection, what we are going to do is we are going to look at a particular organization, and I have from a context picked up Tesco, which is one of the large grocery as well as a large retailer in the country. They employ over, I think, 200,000 people in terms of workforce, and it has operations in 14 different countries. Now, using this example, what we are going to do is we are going to understand the recruitment and selection techniques which Tesco applies in this process to bring in talent or new employees into the organization. And this is important is because it will take us through that 5-6-step process that we have discussed in terms of human resources planning, which HR managers have to put in place. And then sometimes they apply hard HRM approach and sometimes they apply soft HRM approach to recruit employees or recruit resources for a particular vacancy within the organization. Now, it is quite clear to say that different organizations have different processes of recruitment and selection. That means no one company will have a same process of how it recruits people as compared to any other organization in the same sector. Now, because everyone wants to attract the best talent and they want to recruit the best resources, they have developed over the years processes which are very relevant to their own organization. And these processes then look at clearly identifying the skills, knowledge, and experience needed to fill a particular role or fill a particular vacancy in the organization. Now, keeping an example of Tesco in mind, let's understand how the recruitment and selection process works and what are the techniques or what they apply. Now, first thing first is, when you look at Tesco, it's a retailer. It has probably more than 2,000 stores in the UK. And if I look at globally, I think in excess of 6,000 stores across the 14 countries in which it operates. Now, when they have a vacancy which comes in, the vacancy is clearly identified in which department it is, in which section, which pay grade, and what is the vacancy for in terms of the role. So first and foremost in the recruitment and selection process, you need to look at identification of vacancy. Where is the role required? Where is the new employee required? Or what is the area or role which the employee is going to come in and fill? The second part would be to look at development of position description. That means, in short, a job description. Now, if the vacancy is being created for the first time, the HR manager will have to work with the line manager, department manager, or whatever, in terms of maybe where the vacancy is coming, the responsible management person, to be able to create a job description. Now, assuming if Tesco is looking for a CEO or a chief executive officer, then the job description will not just be decided by the HR manager, but they will need to create an initial template that will go across to the board, the current board members, maybe to some key people outside the organization which sit on the board, and that is where the job description or the position description will be finalized. But if it is a job vacancy which they're trying to fill, which is in one of the stores, and this is because of one of the person has left the organization, then it could be that this job description is already in place, and for that reason they might just need to update that particular job description. So for example, in the stores, when you look at retail stores, a lot of people work in the tills, they work in the shop floor department, the IT, this telecoms department, grocery department, things like that. Now, if one of the person ends up leaving, it does not mean that the job description needs to be created. In some cases, the description is there, but they might update that description in terms of the job role with the changing environment, the changing job role over the years. And once created, the revision is primarily done as and when a vacancy arises. Now, once you have that job description, you know where the vacancy is, the HR department might then put a recruitment plan in place. Recruitment plan would be, how would you recruit the person? Whether it will be an internal recruitment, whether it will be external recruitment, will you recruit through externally by an agency? Would you place an advert? That whole plan is primarily, or the whole process will be primarily the recruitment process. And in this case, when we look at the recruitment process, it could involve, say, for example, advertising, advertising the vacancy or the role. Once the responses to the adverts have come in, it will involve some sort of screening. And once the screening has been done, you've made a short list in terms of the number of CVs or the number of candidates which are, shortlisted for that role. You will then start the process of interview. And the interviews could be, in some companies, you have one round of interview, you have second round, in some companies you have even three, depending on the seniority of the role or the person who is joining the role at what level. You might have the interview and selection process to be that complex. So if a CEO is being recruited, you will see that the person or the shortlist is created from appropriate candidates which have the skill, the knowledge, the industry experience, and they are already working or have worked at least with a number of similar positions in the past with other organizations. But if it's a person being interviewed for a store manager role, then in those cases what they will do is they will have a smaller process of interviewing or screening, and that would mean that you will probably end up meeting the branch manager, the regional manager, and he or she will be able to then take a decision of which candidate is to be hired. The CEO might not be required to look at doing the interviews for a store manager. So they go through this process of identification of vacancy, then look at job description. If it's not in existence, if it's there, then update it, and then look at a recruitment plan, internal or external. Advertisement is placed, recruitment shortlist is created, screening is done. Once you have shortlisted candidates, you do interviews, one round, second round. In Tesco, normally there are 2 rounds, and once the interviews have happened, what will happen is they will then give the job to the successful interviewee, and that would mean that you will receive an offer letter or a contract, and then you will be asked to join on a certain particular date. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So that explains that 5 or 6 step process of human resource planning, when we go through the process of understanding first the gap areas, then looking at determination of gap, then looking at the job position or job description, and then looking at finally the process of selection. And once the selection has done, the person has joined, and the person has started performing. After a year, you do the appraisals, monitoring to be able to see if the person is able to achieve and contribute to that job role. So this is how the process of, recruitment and selection would work in a company like Tesco. But generally, most companies would follow similar 5 or 6 step process through which they bring people in to the vacant, to the vacant role, fill the vacant role, or bring somebody into the organization through the process of recruitment and selection. Now, any questions on this so far?
No.
Okay, Daniel, any questions at your end?
Sir, I just want to ask, what is line manager?
So when you look at working within an organization, depending on the structure, typically what happens is there are different terminologies which you get to see used in the organization. Sometimes you will see when you work within a particular department and you report into a department head, that person will be called your line manager. Somebody who is involved in your appraisals, somebody who looks at directly managing you, monitoring you, is the person which is called a line manager. This terminology that you asked me a question comes into play when you see that large organizations like, say, let's look at a company which is present across different countries and you work within a particular department. So the other day I picked up an example of Samsung. Today probably I'll look at an example of Tesco, keeping in mind. Now Tesco has operation in 14 countries. You will see that the top management structure, like the country head of an organization, typically will report into the CEO of an organization. So Tesco's headquarters is based in the UK. So all the 14 regional offices or the countries which have operation, their heads, the country heads actually all report into the CEO in the UK. Sometimes you will see that what will happen is because the revenue being generated by certain regional offices is so big that what they do is they put a structure between the CEO and the country head, and that person might be managing some side of operation. So there'll be vice president of Western Europe, vice president of Eastern Europe and Middle East, or vice president of Southeast Asia. That person might have 2 or 3 regional operations country head reporting into him, and that person then reports into the CEO. So for you, your immediate person who's going to manage your appraisals is called the line manager. But the country head might also directly report into the CEO for certain approvals or budgeting and other things. And that is where functional manager is also a term which is sometimes used. So sometimes you administratively report or administratively report into the immediate person based in the same geography or country, but you sometimes functionally report into another person who's based in a different country. And that is where you will see that these terms like line manager, immediate or my reporting manager or my functional manager as a term comes into play within organizations. Is that okay?
Yes.
So a clear example that I would say, if that's not okay, then would be, if you look at Microsoft as a company, they are organized as product, on the basis of products. So you see the Xbox business head, you see the Windows business head, you see, the mobile business head. Now they are organized on the basis of products. So Google, for example, is also organized on the basis of products. So the search business is business. You see advertising as another side of the business, which is, then you see Google Chrome as one side of the business. So here you will see a lot of engineers and a lot of people working within different countries work within the product segment. And here they work administratively and report to a administrative head within the country, but they will also report functionally into the product head for a particular product they're working on. An example, you have an Xbox product manager in all countries. He or she looks after sales, regionalization of the products, the games and everything. But they report into something called the group product manager, which is based in the US. So administratively, they report into something called the individual head of the organization within a geography, country. But functionally, they report into the head office and report into the product manager, who's the group product manager for that product, which is Xbox. So line manager in this case would be, your line manager will be a group product manager. but your administrative manager or the person who's responsible for your reviews, your pay, your package, your salary, your perks, and your annual appraisals will be the person based in that country. That will be your immediate boss, but your line manager would be, because you are working on a productized function basis, would be your group product manager. Okay?
Yeah.
Good stuff. Any other question, Manur?
No.
Okay, Daniel, any questions from your side?
Sure.
Everything understood?
Yes.
Not really, but
Yeah?
yeah.
You're okay with it, Daniel?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'll do is, after this presentation and the session, I'm going to email you the presentation and also a handout which will cover Learning Outcome 1 and Learning Outcome 2. So the idea would be you go through the handouts to understand the theoretical concept of soft and hard in HRM, and then you understand the process of recruitment and planning and how recruitment planning is done within an organization. And that will help you address these 3 tasks which are in Learning Outcome 2. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. So I will catch up with you in the next session. And the next session for this unit is it going to be next weekend?
No, it's going to be on 16.
On 16. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. No, but I cannot attend because of the timing.
So I've kept it for 3 p.m. And I think it will be about 11 p.m. in Korea.
Yeah,
So
and it will be 5 here, and we have Ramadan starting.
All right, okay. So on that day, what I will do, Manur, is when we do the session, we will send you a copy of the recording.
Okay.
For you to go through, and then what we can do is in the subsequent session that we do, if you have any questions, we'll recap before we start.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
No worries. Okay, thank you so much for joining. Daniel, you have a good night, because I think it's almost midnight in Korea. And Manur, at your end, I would say you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll catch up with you on 16th.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And bye.